If you want to understand the true terrifying power of a cult, you cannot just look at the leader. You have to look at the followers. You have to look at what they are willing to do, and more importantly, what they are willing to believe. In the late 80s, the border between the United States and Mexico was a porous, chaotic frontier. It was the golden age of the marijuana and cocaine cowboys. But with that massive wealth came a suffocating, omnipresent paranoia. A drug smuggler in 1988, Matamoros, woke up every single day knowing that he could be arrested by the DEA, tortured by the Mexican Federal Police, or dismembered by a rival plaza boss. It was an ecosystem of pure, unadulterated anxiety. And into this ecosystem walked Adolfo de Jesús Constanzo. He didn't arrive with an army of sicarios. He arrived with a religion. As we discussed in part one, Constanzo had just slaughtered the Calzada family, the reigning kings of the Matamoros Plaza, feeding them to his iron cauldron, the Nganga. He proved that his dark interpretation of Palo Mayombe could crush traditional cartel power. Now, he was ready to institutionalize his madness. He realized that if he could convince the most ruthless men on the border that he could make them invisible to bullets and law enforcement, he wouldn't just control their money, he would own their souls. This is part two of Los Narcosatánicos, Occult Syndicalism, and the Fall.
To understand the sheer industrial scale of what Constanzo built in Matamoros, we have to look at the Hernandez family. Before Constanzo arrived, the Hernandez clan, Elio, Serafin, and Evidio, were mid-level players. They were capable smugglers, moving decent weight across the Rio Grande into Texas, but they were overshadowed by the Cruzadas. When the Cruzadas were butchered by Constanzo, the Hernandez family watched the balance of power shift overnight. They didn't fight Constanzo, they submitted to him. In exchange for their absolute loyalty, Constanzo elevated the Hernandez ring. They provided the muscle, the logistics, and the sprawling, isolated piece of property called Rancho Santa Elena, located about 20 miles outside of Matamoros. Constanzo provided the spiritual armor. This partnership created something historically unique: occult syndicalism. The drug trade is usually a highly rational, profit driven enterprise. But under Constanzo, the Hernandez smuggling ring became a fundamentalist religious sect. Every business decision was dictated by the tarot cards. Every smuggling route was cleared by the spirits. Rancho Santa Elena became a fortress, not because of its physical walls, but because of the wooden shed in the coral. Inside that shed sat the Nganga. Constanzo taught the Hernandez brothers that as long as the Nganga was fed with human blood, their drug shipments would never be intercepted.
The most terrifying aspect of the Rancho Santa Elena operation was how effective the delusion actually was. When you look at the logistics of smuggling, the biggest liability is human error. A smuggler gets nervous at a border checkpoint. He sweats. He avoids eye contact. The custom dogs pick up on the cortisol. The border agent pulls the truck over into secondary inspection, and the load is busted. Constanzo engineered a psychological hack to bypass this completely. Before a major marijuana run, Constanzo would gather the Hernandez brothers and their drivers in the blood-soaked shed. He would perform a visceral, terrifying ritual. He would take a razor blade and slice the chests and arms of the smugglers. He would reach into the Nganga, pull out a necrotic, bloody paste of human brain matter, animal blood, and dirt, and rub it directly into their open wounds. As he did this, he chanted, assuring them that this magical branding made them physically invisible to the U.S. Border Patrol. It made them bulletproof. And the smugglers believed him. They believed him with absolute certainty of religious zealots. When Serafin Hernandez or his drivers pulled a truck loaded with 500 pounds of marijuana up to the bridge at Brownsville, Texas, they didn't sweat. They didn't break eye contact. They smiled at the border guards. They possessed the fearless calm of men who believed they were literal ghosts. Because they acted so completely normal, the border guards waved them right through. The magic was a self-fulfilling prophecy. The psychological armor Constanzo provided actually made them better criminals.
But the Nganga was a parasite, and the parasite is always hungry. To keep the magic working, Constanzo demanded more sacrifices. The victims were initially rival dealers and corrupt cops, but by the spring of 1989, Constanzo's arrogance had metastasized into absolute megalomania. He believed he was a living god, and a god does not hide. He decided that the Nganga needed a new kind of fuel. He told his inner circle, including his high priestess, the Texas college student, Sarah Eldrede, that the spirits required an Anglo brain. He theorized that the spirit of a white, educated American student would grant the culture in a more potent, strategic form of magical intelligence. March 1989 was spring break. South Padre Island and the neighboring border towns were flooded with thousands of American college students. The streets of Matamoros were packed with easy prey. On the night of March 14th, Constanzo ordered his men to go hunting. They drove a truck through the crowded neon-lit streets near the bars. They spotted a 21-year-old pre-med student from the University of Texas named Mark Kilroy. He had simply walked a few steps away from his friends to use a restroom. Constanzo's men grabbed him, forced him into the back of the truck, and vanished into the night. Mark Kilroy was taken to Rancho Santa Elena, where he was tortured and sacrificed by Constanzo himself.
Constanzo believed this sacrifice would cement his empire forever. In reality, it was the geopolitical equivalent of stepping on a landmine. By kidnapping an upper middle class white American college student, Constanzo had crossed the one line the cartels knew you never cross. The disappearance of Mark Kilroy erupted into a massive international crisis. Mark's family had political connections in Texas. The U.S. State Department, the FBI, and the DEA descended on the border. Unprecedented pressure was applied to the Mexican government. The message from Washington to Mexico City was clear. Find this boy, or the border shuts down. Cameron County Sheriff Alex Perez and Mexican Comandante Juan Benitez Ayala launched a relentless dragnet. They interrogated every informant, raided every known stash house, and squeezed every cartel connection they had. But Constanzo's operation was hermetically sealed cult. Nobody talks. For weeks, the investigation went absolutely nowhere. The U.S. media began running wall-to-wall coverage of the missing spring breaker.
The break in the case is one of the most darkly ironic moments in criminal history. It didn't come from a wiretap. It didn't come from brilliant forensic work. It came from the absolute fatal delusion of the cult itself. On April 9th, 1989, the Mexican Federal Police set up a routine, unrelated drug checkpoint on a dusty highway outside Matamoros. Serafin Hernandez, high on his own supply of magical invincibility, drove up to the checkpoint in a truck packed with marijuana. Earlier that day, Constanzo had performed a ritual on him. Serafin fundamentally believed he was invisible. So instead of stopping, instead of turning around, he just drove right through the police barricade. He expected the police to stare blankly into empty space. Instead, the police jumped into their cruisers, chased him down, and dragged him out of the truck. Under the brutal reality of a Mexican police interrogation, Serafin Hernandez broke. The delusion of the cult shattered against the concrete walls of the police station. He confessed to the drug smuggling, and he told the police about the ranch. On April 11th, heavily armed police units breached the gates of Rancho Santa Elena. What they found there permanently altered the psychological landscape of law enforcement.
The smell hit them first. a sickening, coppery stench of rotting meat and dried blood. Inside the wooden shed, they found the nganga. It was a horrific monument to madness. Inside, the heavy iron pot was blood, a dead black cat, a horseshoe, a roasted turtle, and floating on the surface, a human brain. The police brought Serafin Hernandez out to the corral. They handed him a shovel and told him to dig. Over the next few days, the police dug up 15 horribly mutilated bodies, buried in shallow graves around the property. Many had their spines removed. Many had their hearts cut out. And one of them, identified by dental records, was Mark Kilroy. The footage of the excavation was broadcast globally. The media coined the term Los Narcosatánicos. But the Godfather was missing. Adolfo Constanzo and Sarah Aldrete had seen the news. They had abandoned the ranch days earlier and fled south to the sprawling, anonymous metropolis of Mexico City. For weeks, an international manhunt paralyzed Mexico. Constanzo was hiding in a luxury apartment building on Cuauhtémoc Boulevard with his most fanatical inner circle, including his lover and enforcer, Martin Quintana. But the paranoia was eating them alive. Constanzo realized the magic was broken.
The police were closing the net. They had captured one of Constanzo's associates in Mexico City who had broken under interrogation and gave up the location of the apartment. On May 6, 1989, hundreds of heavily armed police officers surrounded the building of Cuauhtémoc Boulevard. Constanzo looked out the window and realized the end had come. But a god does not surrender to mortals. He decided to go out in an apocalyptic blaze of glory. Constanzo and his enforcers grabbed Uzi submachine guns and AK-47s and opened fire on the street below. The shootout lasted for 45 minutes. Bullets shattered the windows, raining glass onto the pavement. In the final surreal act of defiance and madness, Constanzo grabbed handfuls of $100 bills, his drug fortune, and threw them out the window. He watched the cash drift down like green snow onto the street amidst the gunfire. When the police brought in tear gas and began shooting out the door locks, Constanzo made his final move. He refused to let the Mexican justice system strip him of his myth. He handed his submachine gun to one of his surviving hitmen, Alvaro de Leon, known as El Dubi. Constanzo hugged his lover, Martin Quintana, and ordered El Dubi to execute them both. El Dubi, conditioned by years of absolute obedience, was weeping, but he raised the weapon and pulled the trigger, cutting down the Godfather and his high priest. When the police finally breached the smoking, bullet-riddled apartment, they found Constanzo and Quintana dead in a closet. Sarah Eldrede was found alive in the bathroom and sentenced to over 60 years in prison. The Godfather was dead, but the psychological scars of his empire remained.
All right, we've reached the end of the show and it's time for final thoughts. When we look back at the inferno of Rancho Santa Elena, the temptation is to view Adolfo Constanzo as a supernatural monster, a boogeyman created by the 1980s drug war. It's easier to sleep at night if we believe that what happened in Matamoros was an isolated glitch in human morality, a satanic panic that could never be replicated. But stripped of the iron cauldrons and the animal bones, the mechanics of Constanzo's empire are terrifyingly mundane. He didn't use magic to control people. He used their own paralyzing fears. He built a fortress out of human desperation. He looked at drug smugglers who were terrified of the DEA, and he sold them the delusion of invisibility. He looked at college students who wanted to feel powerful, and he gave them a secret identity. The tragedy of Mark Kilroy and the 15 people buried in the corral is a devastating reminder of the fatal cost of arrogance and blind belief. When you allow a charismatic predator to define reality for you, when you let them convince you that normal rules of the universe no longer apply to your actions, you have already surrendered your soul. Constanzo's followers believed they were bulletproof right up until the moment the handcuffs clicked shut. They believed they were invisible right up until the world saw their crimes broadcast on the evening news. The cauldrons may be broken, and Adolfo Constanzo may have died in a closet, but the human vulnerability he exploited, That's still out there, waiting for the next predator to put a price tag on salvation. Be careful who you trust to protect you, and be absolutely certain you know what they are asking for in return. Take care of yourselves and take care of each other. We'll see you next time.